Good afternoon and welcome to Lecture 3 on the Executive Branch. Today we are going to, this is sort of the transition from talking about the presidency itself to the executive branch as a whole. And to do that, we're going to start out by talking about the presidency as an institution. So there's a set of executive branch agencies and offices that exist in the White House, and then there's the larger structure of the federal agencies and the cabinet and independent agencies and things like that. So we're going to go through these so that you have a better handle on what that looks like. So inside the White House, there is an explicit part of the structure of the White House called the Executive Office of the President. And this was instituted during the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And its goal is to be staff assistants to the president. So this is not necessarily about politics or policy. That will come in a minute. This is more about sort of information gathering that's specific to the president in terms of making their decisions. And so examples of this are things like the Office of Management and Budget, the National Security Council, and the Council of Economic Advisors. So let's use the National Security Council as an example. So there are people that the president nominates to be part of the National Security Council. So it's a group of people who are meant to advise the president on national security issues. And then the National Security Council also has a staff, has a group of people who help those council members do their job. And often those are people who are part of other executive branch agencies like the Defense Department, the State Department, things like that. The National Security Agency, which is a different organization than the National Security Council. But the idea here is that those are people whose job it is to, regardless of politics, advise the president. And that's true for the Council of Economic Advisors and OMB as well. Now, the thing is that the president recognizes that they are not simply a information using office, they're a political office as well. And so there are a group of people who are, it's a part of the executive branch bureaucracy, but it's called the White House Office. Now, these are people whose job it is to protect the political interests of the president. So if you've ever watched The West Wing, that's who all those people are. So people who are policy advisors and special assistants and the chief of staff and the press secretary, and these are the people whose job it is to, yes, do policy, but they're the ones who are paying attention to the political implications of creating and communicating that policy. So in that sense, the executive office of the president is intended to be a bit more objective. And could, in theory, be exactly the same people from president to president. The White House office is much more specifically staffed by people who are linked to the president's goals and political priorities. They're often people who worked on the campaign very closely with the president or who are either personal friends or professional friends with the president. So that includes the chief of staff. Their job is policymaking and coordination, including things like talking to party leadership on the Hill and working to convince party leadership of things. They do a lot of lobbying. They generally have their own pollsters. They're doing that kind of political activity inside the White House office. They're also responsible for internal coordination of the messages that are coming out of the administration, right? So usually within the White House office, there'll also be liaisons to different groups within the executive and legislative branches who are working to help the president get their policy agenda passed. So the thing is that the way you can think about this in a lot of ways is that the White House office is yes, it is part of the bureaucracy, but it is not. Doesn't necessarily operate in the same ways that we have seen that bureaucracies can operate. Generally speaking, this is a much sort of smaller, more agile staff that's much easier. They don't have civil service protections. They're in and out based on what the president thinks. The executive office of the president moves over more closely to what we think of as a bureaucracy in the sense that that's intended to be based on a meritocracy, although obviously the president has a lot of say on who those people are. And then we move over to the other sort of parts of the White House offices. The first is the office of the vice president. And this is a weird one because there's no constitutional instructions for the vice president. There's no powers in the Constitution about anything beyond succession, about saying, yep, you get to be president if something happens to the existing president. That's it. And so vice presidents have sort of varied over time in terms of how much impact they've really had. Lots of people talk about the vice president being the most senior unimportant office in the country. And so in many cases, vice presidents have just sort of hung out. In fact, LBJ famously did not want to become vice president because he was head of the majority party in the Senate, and he was very powerful. He was the majority whip in the Senate, and he was very, very powerful in that position. And becoming vice president actually meant he would have less power. But over the past 30 years or so, vice presidents have ended up operating in some different ways. Now, in terms of elections, the theory is, of course, that the vice presidents from a different region of the country will help you get votes. That's the evidence, and that's a little bit unclear. Although, of course, it is clear from the Constitution they cannot be from the same state. So what's generally happened in terms of vice president over the last couple administrations, the vice president is designed to bolster some part of the president's history or experience or relationship to voters, right? So famously, George W. Bush picked Dick Cheney as his vice president because Bush didn't have very much foreign policy experience, and Dick Cheney really did. Obama chose Vice President Biden because of Biden's long-term relationship with people in Washington, as well as his relationships primarily with the white working class. And so in that sense, the vice president can have a role if the president gives them the role. Question marks across the board. The first lady, the first spouse. Sometimes the first lady has been very influential and important. I mean, obviously, part of the situation is it's unlikely that you're going to get a person who is married to the president who doesn't share the president's goals, right, or share the president's ideas. But various first ladies have had different expectations of the role, right? So what the sort of normal thing that has happened over the last 50 years or so is that first ladies tend to take some kind of issue on, right? Not a super political issue, but one that is something that they have some experience in, right? So this is why Laura Bush was very focused on childhood literacy, because that was something that was important to her as a librarian. Nancy Reagan was famously sort of the education version of the war on drugs, right? With these are the ads that I used to see on Saturday morning cartoons about the anti-drug campaign, right? The egg and the frying pan. This is your brain on drugs, right? Like that was sort of famously Nancy Reagan's thing. And Michelle Obama did a lot of work on food insecurity and childhood obesity and things like that. So it's those kinds of things, like stuff that aren't necessarily, that are like problems or issues, but not something that's going to get a person in trouble. So, it's very unclear. And and we talked about this a lot too. I mean, what if Hillary Clinton had won? How does a former president be the first spouse, right? Like, what does that look like? Or what would it look like for a person to be in that first spouse role who really doesn't want to be in the limelight? I mean, Melania Trump is kind of like that, but she's a little bit has been a little bit more of a public figure before she became the first lady. So it's kind of a weird thing, right? And you don't expect the president to be married to a person who is not, educated and policy oriented and an interesting person in their own right. They can't just be it's unlikely that they'll just, because of how marriage works, that it'll just be somebody who doesn't want to be in the spotlight at all. So it's a very weird position. And I have no real like intellectual or political insight into this role. But all right, so let's talk about then the executive branch beyond the White House. So this is the actual agencies that are helping to create federal policy outside of the White House. Now, in theory or in reality, these people are still part of the executive branch, but they have less sort of everyday interaction with the president beyond the leaders and directors of each of these agencies. Now, there are 4 types of executive branch agencies, and that's really important that you understand, because understanding the differences among these types tells you a whole lot about how the executive branch organization works. So what you see here is it's sort of a large-scale organizational chart for the entire government. And what you see here is that it is the executive branch that largely makes up the bulk of the bodies that are the government, right? The legislative branch and the judicial branch are co-equal, and they have their own service agencies within them, right? We talked about the Library of Congress and the Congressional Budget Office and things like that. But largely what we're talking about is part of the executive branch. So the first kind of executive agency are cabinet departments. Now, cabinet departments have a definition in the Constitution. They are the people who are the head of the federal departments, right? That's what a cabinet member is. And these are meant to be sort of large, that cover major areas of policy. And they are long-term, and they have sort of lives of their own in terms of policy making and in paying attention to and being a part of policy in a particular area. So cabinet departments report to the president. They are headed up by cabinet secretaries who are appointed by the president and who are approved by the Senate. They cover major areas of policy, and they are subdivided. And some examples of this are State Department, the Treasury Department. And here you can see this is a listing of just sort of their average number of civilian employees. So agriculture, commerce, labor, defense, transportation. So here's another way to think about this. This is the organizational chart for the Department of Agriculture. And remember how I said that they were subdivided? Well, this gives you a really good picture of that. So the secretary, right, is the one at the top. They are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. There's the deputy secretary. There's assistant secretaries for different kinds of issues. And then there are undersecretaries that cover the particular subdivisions. Now, generally speaking, those are the people who are going to be appointed by the president. Everything below that is going to be civil service, and we'll talk about civil service at the end of the lecture today. But what you can see here is that the Department of Agriculture is subdivided. There's an undersecretary for natural resources and environment, undersecretary for farm and foreign agriculture services, for rural development, for food and nutrition, for food safety, on and on and on. Because this is sort of the long-term commitment to the Department of Agriculture. And here's the really interesting thing in here. So what you can see inside of some agencies, and this becomes important later on, is that they are tasked with different issues, right? So here's the one. So if you look here at the Department of Agriculture, you will see under the far right, marketing and regulatory programs, the Agricultural Marketing Service. The Agricultural Marketing Service are the people that we have to thank for cheese crust stuffed pizza. Yep, for stuffed crust pizza. Because what they do is that they work with industry to find good uses for agricultural products. And so one of the things they spent a long time trying to increase people's consumption of or increase the use of was cheese. And so that's why we have stuffed crust pizza. Now, here's the thing though. If you look somewhere in the middle and you see the Food, Nutrition, and Consumer Services, and you see the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion, those are the people who came up with the food pyramid. Guess what? The cheese part of the food pyramid is pretty high in the sense that you're not supposed to have that much of it. And so you can have a situation where you have one part of the Department of Agriculture trying to get people to eat more cheese, and one part of the Department of Agriculture trying to get people to eat less cheese. And that's just part of the deal, right? So, and that's one of the things to pay attention to when you think about cabinet agencies, and why, as we'll see, some presidents have pulled pieces out of cabinet agencies and made them their own independent agencies. And so independent executive agencies are our next kind of agency. These are agencies that report directly to the president, but Congress decides where they go, sort of how they fit into the structure, and how they're funded. So what are independent executive agencies? Well, these are things that the president has pulled out of cabinet agencies, basically. So the best example of this on this page is NASA, right? The National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So NASA originally started out as the space program was in the Air Force, right? But because of the commitment that Eisenhower made to making space non-military, they pulled NASA out of the Department of Defense and gave it its own independent agency because it needed to operate independently, have its own budget, have its own leadership and stuff like that. And you can see there's a lot of these kinds of independent agencies. The CIA works that way. Now there's a long kind of conversation we can have about intelligence gathering in the United States, but just know that in this case, the CIA is its own independent executive agency, while, for example, the FBI is part of the Justice Department. So it is, in fact, part of a cabinet agency. All right, so that's independent executive agencies. Then there are independent regulatory agencies. And the important deal here is that these report to Congress. So they are, while they are part of the executive branch, and they are created inside the executive branch, they report to Congress and they're responsible for specific policies. So their job is to make and enforce rules that are implementation of the law passed by Congress, particularly in areas where Congress said, you know what, we need more help in the implementation, or there needs to be an agency that's specifically designed for this. Good example, if you look down here, you find the Nuclear Regulatory Commission at the bottom. Why is that? Well, because Congress decided after some close calls in the early 70s that it was inappropriate for there to be the promotion of nuclear energy inside the Department of Energy and the regulation of those energy sources also in the Department of Energy. And so they pulled out the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and made it its own independent regulatory agency whose job it is to be separate from the Department of Energy in terms of regulation and operating safely. So there's a bunch of these kinds of regulatory agencies. So the Securities and Exchange Commission, which governs how stock exchanges work, the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates all communication by television and radio, and they're the ones who determine what the frequencies are, all these kinds of things. Those are all independent regulatory agencies. And so they're tasked with specifically regulating. Okay, then the fourth kind of federal agency is called a government corporation. Now, these are kind of weird because they're not super obvious what is going on here. But basically, they're the administration of a quasi-business. All profits go back to the company, but they are owned by the government. So what does this mean? Examples are best here. The Postal Service is a government corporation. The Postal Service the function of the mail is the constitutional function, but because of the distribution of that, of the needs of that organization, Congress decided it made more sense for it to operate as its own sort of quasi-owned corporation. So while it still reports to Congress, is regulated by Congress, It can't change postal rates without congressional agreement. It operates as its own business. And so it can innovate and it can do payroll the way it wants to. And it can, so all these kinds of things. The other one to pay attention to is Amtrak, right? And Amtrak is like the opposite of the post office. Amtrak is one of those things where Congress thought it is important for there to be cross-country train travel possibilities. And it largely subsidizes Amtrak. This is about keeping Amtrak going as opposed to sort of setting it free to do its own thing, right? So it's pretty much the opposite of the Postal Service. But those are both examples of government corporations, and they're not very many of them, to be perfectly honest. They're not many of them in relationship to things like independent executive agencies and independent regulatory agencies, but there are a few that make sense for us to know about. So those are the four kinds of executive branch agency: independent executive agency, cabinet agency, independent regulatory agency, and government corporation. Now, let's talk for a minute about people who work in those agencies. Now, we did say that at the top layer are the presidential appointees, and there are a small number of each of those agencies is made up of presidential appointees. It's somewhere between a little less than 1% up to about 2.5% of each agency. And it's almost always just that top branch. So what goes on with all the other people who work for those agencies? Well, these are called civil service workers. Now, what you have to understand is that this represents a sort of a deep evolution in our system. So in early America, right, remember we talked about this earlier this week. It's the idea that the president's advisors, their cabinet officials, could sit around a dining room table at the beginning of the republic, right? So there was the president. Often the vice president wasn't considered to be part even of the advisor system, right? So it was, the secretaries of the four existing cabinets, agencies, and their clerks, and that was it. Well, but that grew, particularly through the Postal Service, right? So the post office was a functioning part of the executive branch, and the Postmaster General actually sat on the cabinet initially. That was part of the idea. But the thing is that the president, the executive branch, had to hand out all the jobs in the executive branch. So particularly in terms of having a postmaster in places, that was what the executive branch did. And so that was called the spoils system, which meant that if you won the presidency, that meant you had the power to fill all those jobs, which was awesome at one level and terrible at another level, right? So there were times in which presidents, particularly during the mid-19th century, were appointing 5,000 and 6,000 people, right? Today, the president only has the power to appoint around 1,500 people. So it's just a huge amount of people. So the reform begins in the 1880s. And the goal here is to move these jobs into a system that is based largely on civil service systems in other parts of the world. And the idea is it's supposed to be a meritocracy, and that people get their jobs through education and testing and seniority, right? So building up all of those things that we think about as part of bureaucratic processes. Because the idea is, how do we get the best people to serve the American voters, right? How do we do that? And that's not clearly to put people in there who are just friends with the president. The way to do that is to demonstrate they have these powers, that they have these skills and they have the ability to do these things. And so early on, most of the jobs you got by taking a test. Well, over time, that sort of morphed into educational attainment, right? So in some cases, you still have to take civil service tests for certain kinds of jobs. But for most of the time, a college degree is a proxy for a test, or a graduate degree, and then that tells you what level you'll get to be put in at. So, for example, in the Foreign Service, they have actually kept a test. So you have to pass the Foreign Service exam in order to become part of the diplomatic corps in the State Department. That test is really hard to pass. In fact, most of the people that I know who have passed that exam, who work and embassies all over the world have either master's degrees or PhDs, and most of them had to try to take the exam more than once to pass it. So it's a very difficult exam, and that was the idea, is how to get the best and the brightest. So what happens? Well, over time, that morphs into more and more of the executive branch agencies are staffed by civil service. And we get to the point where the concern is largely like, well, we have all these people. How do we manage them, right? And so this is what the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 does. It puts into place something called the Office of Personnel Management, which is actually basically like human resources for the federal government. And also Merit Systems Protection Board, basically to give people protection of civil service. Now, why is that? Because many of you have heard, and it's true, right? It's really hard to get fired from a government job. Well, that's because they want to make it difficult for somebody to get fired for political reasons, right? The goal of civil service, the goal of federal agency employment is to be objective, right? To serve the citizens of the United States regardless of their partisan ideology, right? And that comes with some other problems, which I'm going to suggest you read about in your book, about things like the Hatch Act and ARS, people who work for the federal government allowed to express political opinions at all, right? And it takes some Supreme Court cases in the 70s and 80s to make sure to protect the First Amendment rights of members of the federal government civil service system. But the bottom line is this: the civil service is designed to give the best possible employees to the federal government and protect them from political interference. Now, whether or not that's possible, what it really means is that people have a lot of job protection, and that is what can sometimes make the bureaucracy a fairly complicated and old school kind of status quo institution, because there are lots of people working there who've worked there for a long time. But what's the alternative, right? So if we start to remove those protections, make it easier for people to get fired, then, we have some real questions about democracy, right? Is it okay for people to be able to be fired for any reason at all in a system where we're so politically divided that it would be really easy for a person inside that civil service system to just start getting rid of people they disagree with, right? That's a problem. And so that's why the system is set up the way it is and why it is complicated. Now, this is not to say that there aren't ways to make it less complicated, but that's a question for public administration, not for our conversation today. So in the next video, we're going to talk about how regulations get made, and I'm going to be suggesting to you some stuff you need to pay attention to in the book.